3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability uniquely
Without a heritage, every generation starts over.
to remind the current regime
what your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
Completed in 2003, the Human Genome Project was one of the most ambitious research projects in history. At the outset, the mission seemed simple enough. Just as a computer has code written in binary, that is in ones and zeros, human DNA is written in a molecular pattern that forms the genes that are passed down from parents to offspring. The goal was to write that code down and map where the genes occurred within it. But the undertaking was massive. The human genome is composed of 3 billion individual units of code. Beginning in 1999, it took scientists from 6 countries, working with the best computing technology then available, 13 years of work to complete the task. The effort cost more than $5 billion in today's dollars, but the return on that investment has been high. The Human Genome Project has been instrumental in understanding genetic diseases, creating personalized therapies and medical treatments, and breeding crops that are more abundant and hardy, along with a host of other benefits. The majority of the funding for this effort came from the U.S. government, specifically from the National Institute of Health, or NIH. Obviously, American taxpayer money can be used to great effect, and we like to think that our civil institutions would always be dedicated to delivering such good return on investment. But that's not always so. The Trump administration's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE effort, has shed much light in recent weeks on waste, fraud, and abuse throughout the federal government. Now, the spotlight has been turned on NIH. Heritage Foundation Senior Research Fellow Jay Greene has been studying the federal grant process through NIH for many years and has warned that the system has its problems. All right, Jay Greene, welcome to Heritage Explains.
Thanks for having me on.
So can you tell us who you are and what you do at the Heritage Foundation?
Sure. I'm a senior research fellow in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And I used to be professor at the University of Arkansas. I was an endowed chair. I had the rank of distinguished professor, and I was the director of a federally funded research lab.
So we're about to talk about that because that's about to become important. But what made you decide to make the jump from academia into studying academia?
I was a professor of education policy, and I'm still working on education policy, but I left university in part because things went increasingly crazy in academia. And I'm grateful and thrilled to be at the Heritage Foundation so that we might fix some of those problems and make academia a place that's more productive for students, more welcoming for a diverse group of faculty, and serves the interests of the United States better.
So what we'd like to talk to you about specifically today is funding that comes to universities through the National Institute of Health. There's a very particular way that this functions. Can you tell us about it?
Sure. So the federal government really started funding medical research and other scientific research at universities in a large way after World War II. And they provided both money for the research and money for overhead on conducting that research. So there are certain fixed costs associated with doing research. You need buildings, you need labs, you need some administrators who handle all the paperwork related to the grants. And some of those things are difficult to allocate to specific research projects and itemize in the grant. And so rather than itemize each of those expenses, they lump them all together in something called overhead, or what's also called indirect costs on federal research grants.
When you're awarded a grant from the federal government, how much are we talking about would go to overhead?
Until this policy change goes into effect, the average university gets 58.3 cents for every dollar that they get for the research. They get another 58.3 cents for overhead. So if the entire grant, costs $1.60, $1 is going to research, 60 cents is going to overhead.
Wow. That seems like a really high number.
It is. And it's part of why the universities are fighting so aggressively to keep it, because this is, frankly, the largest source of federal subsidy to research-intensive universities, far more than subsidized student loans or any other kind of direct appropriation. This is the cash cow for research-intensive universities from the federal government.
So now something has changed. With the second Trump administration, there has been a change in the rules surrounding this. Can you talk about that?
Right. So they issued an order saying that they would no longer pay the indirect rates that universities had been accustomed to receiving, and they would cap those rates going forward and perhaps applying to existing grants at 15 cents on the dollar. So what's called a 15% indirect rate, as opposed to whatever rate they had previously negotiated, which on average was close to 60 cents on the dollar.
Universities, as we might imagine, have kicked up quite a fuss over this change.
They have.
And can you talk about some of the objections and maybe what the responses to those objections might be?
Sure. So they say, look, you can't do research unless you have buildings and laboratories and equipment. And that equipment is very expensive and those buildings are very expensive. And how in the world are we supposed to do research if you don't give us 60 cents on the dollar? We may have to stop. So there's a threat here where universities are basically saying, we might have to, stop curing cancer unless taxpayers cough up 60 cents in overhead for every dollar in research they fund.
And I think a really important note, because you have an excellent Daily Signal piece on this that we will include in the show notes, but an important distinction that you make is that the change in the rule the Trump administration made doesn't affect the overall amount of money that's going to these institutions. It just changes how much of that can be marked for overhead expenses of this sort. For the university's perspective, one would think that it wouldn't matter all that much. But why does that distinction matter so much?
Sure. So NIH currently spends $35 billion. And what this change would do is simply alter the mix of how much of that $35 billion goes to indirect or overhead costs and how much of it goes to directly funding the research. And actually, if you cap the amount that's available for overhead, you actually increase the amount of funding of actual research. So the NIH policy change is an increase in funding for research. It's simply a decrease in funding for overhead. Now, the reason why universities object so fiercely to this is because that overhead is effectively a slush fund that they can use for whatever they want to advance their personal agendas, their political agendas. It's being used to cross-subsidize a lot of other nonsense at universities. And so if you give them more money for the research, but you decrease the pool of money available to them as a slush fund, the administrators lose this power that they have of controlling the discretionary use of the indirect funds.
Going back to the objections then, that leads to the question of what are these universities going to do if they don't have this 60% designated overhead? How are they going to pay for those buildings and for that equipment?
First thing to keep in mind is their threat that they're going to stop doing research or significantly curtail significant research is a complete bluff. And we should call them on that bluff. There's no way in the world that they are going to stop doing something that frankly is their mission to do. They have nonprofit status in order to conduct that research. They're already raising a ton of money from others to do that research. The taxpayers are nice enough to give them money to do that research and overhead on top of that. If they don't think they get enough overhead, stopping to do that research would be insane on their part. They'd be losing a ton of money from every other source, and they'd be betraying their core mission. Frankly, they could put their nonprofit status in jeopardy if they were to threaten to do that. So I don't think anyone should be afraid that there will actually be a decrease in research, that universities will stop curing cancer. So if you're a cancer patient and you're very concerned about continuing cutting edge work, this will not negatively affect that in any way. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. I think that the other thing that we need to think about is how much do universities actually need for overhead? I mean, just because universities wave their hands and say, well, there are fixed costs associated with doing research. Buildings do cost money, labs do cost money, doesn't mean that they need 60 cents on the dollar, right? And so then the question is, well, how much do they actually need? And the answer is no one knows. They don't know. And the reason why no one knows, including the universities themselves, is that it's an inherently ambiguous exercise to calculate the fixed costs of a project. Because there's a judgment about whether a cost can in fact be itemized and listed on the grant, or cannot be itemized and allocated to a specific research project. So, for example, if buildings cost money, you might be able to charge rent to research projects. Or if there's expensive equipment involved, you could allocate fractional share. In other words, you could move things from overhead to actual direct expenditures that are itemized in the research project. And I think that's some of what might happen as the federal government caps the amount for overhead is it'll force the universities to itemize more of their expenses. Now, the reason why that's good is because when the universities itemize expenses on their research grants, they're held accountable for spending the money in that way. So if they say we spend money on this piece of equipment, they actually have to spend the money on that equipment. They can't divert it for some other purpose, like funding their DEI bureaucracy or funding, a new gender studies major that they wish to launch. And so the more accountable the universities are for their research spending by having to itemize the expenses, the better it is for taxpayers. The more we can be confident that they're really using the money for research as taxpayers intended and not for cross-subsidizing their own agendas and other nonsense at universities.
One of the other areas that you've studied and that has some impact upon this conversation is the growth in administration in universities. You mentioned that we've seen a huge growth in administrators, many of them associated with DEI projects and programs at universities. How do these two issues relate to one another?
So because the overhead is effectively a slush fund that can be used at the discretion of administrators at universities, they use it to advance their agendas. And one of the things that has been beneficial for their personal careers is to build out DEI bureaucracies. Now, they're not doing that because they deeply believe in that DEI ideology. They're doing it because it looks good. It's fashionable. It helps them get promoted to a higher position or maybe get hired at a higher status university if they can list on their resume that they built out this big DEI bureaucracy. It also fends off angry groups of students and faculty who might be hassling them. And they could say, well, we're taking care of your concerns. We've built out this bureaucracy specifically to address those issues. And so we've observed that for every $100 million a university gets in overhead, they hire an additional 15.5 DEI bureaucrats. So that's one of the things they can do with this slush fund is to build out big DEI bureaucracies. Now, they do lots of other things too, including, again, cross-subsidizing unprofitable majors, offering fellowships for people in the humanities where there really is very little demand. So they can cross-subsidize other unprofitable activities at the universities. Frankly, that's not what taxpayers had in mind when they provided funding to the NIH. They thought they were funding research in medical science and not cross-subsidizing whatever it is that university bureaucrats decided they wanted to do.
You mentioned that the way that these research grants are structured, they have some advantage for large coastal educational institutions. This change will have some benefit for folks who are in like the American heartland. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So one of the things that research-intensive universities do with overhead money, with indirect funds, is they use it to find promising researchers at lower status universities and they try to hire them. They try to, offer them a higher salary and move them to their university. In other words, it's as if we were giving money to Amazon, public funds to Amazon, for them to buy out every other competing online retailer, right? So the research-intensive universities with the biggest slush fund have the biggest war chest to go out and hire competing or potentially competing researchers and lure them to their universities so they generate even more in indirect funds, so they have an even bigger slush fund. And so the money gets concentrated. The research funds get concentrated in a handful of incredibly rich coastal universities. Now, that's great for the people who live in those areas, because there are secondary benefits to having that critical mass of researchers all in one place, including, like a biomedical companies will locate there. But it's a disservice to other places where talent is being taken away. And so we really want there to be a fair competition among universities for talented researchers. And we don't want to take, every talented researcher out of Nebraska or Iowa and move them to California or Massachusetts. And that is the system right now. I do want to make sure that we also talk a little bit about how else we know that 60 cents is way too high for an indirect rate. And 15 cents on the dollar might be reasonable, even though we don't really know, what the exact right rate should be. So one other thing that gives us a clue that 60 cents on the dollar for overhead is way too much is that taxpayers are the only suckers who pay that rate. Okay. And they pay that rate because they have no idea that they're doing that. They have no idea that they're paying 60 cents on every dollar for overhead on the research they fund. By comparison, private foundations funded by billionaires like Bill Gates or George Soros or the Walton family, they pay between 0 and 15 cents on the dollar for research. And they pay a lot less because they know that they don't want to be ripped off, and they insist that they won't pay more. And the universities gladly take their money. So clearly it's worth it for the universities to conduct research, even when they get 15 cents on the dollar. And so that raises the question, well, why is the taxpayer paying 4 times what a billionaire like Bill Gates is paying for the same research? So the NIH has said, well, if 15 cents on the dollar is good enough for you to take from Bill Gates, we think it should be good enough for you to take from taxpayers too. And I think that's probably how they came up with that 15 cents figure. And another reason we have to believe that 60 cents on the dollar is way too high for overhead is that universities do have fixed costs, but they raise money for their fixed costs from donors. So there are donors who build those buildings and put their names on them. There are donors who build research labs and put their names on them. And then what they're doing with this overhead is they're charging depreciation on those buildings and depreciation on those labs to taxpayers for a building that the university didn't have to pay for in the first place. And they also know that the next building is going to be paid for by the next donor. So that means that money for overhead that covered depreciation is, again, just a slush fund. They're making taxpayers pay a second time for something that their donors have already paid for. And that's why places like Harvard, with over $50 billion in endowment, pile up bigger and bigger indirect cost slush funds on NIH research grants, because they have a lot of donors and a big endowment to pay for their fixed costs already. They don't need taxpayers to pay again. And the proper way that people should be thinking about this is that the universities, again, have a mission to do this research. And they're not entitled to taxpayers paying them to fulfill their mission of doing research, let alone entitled for taxpayers to pay for the indirect cost or the overhead cost on doing that research, let alone entitled to a rate of 60 cents on the dollar for that overhead. All of this sense of entitlement on the part of very rich universities is politically tone deaf. These places are very wealthy, hardworking, ordinary Americans are willing to pay taxes to try to make medical scientific advances so that we can cure cancer or other diseases, but they shouldn't be treated as suckers. And right now, universities are treating ordinary taxpayers as suckers. This new executive order by the Trump administration, puts taxpayers on the same footing as billionaires, and makes it so that taxpayers don't pay any more than billionaires pay. And that seems to be demanding fair treatment for ordinary Americans and supporting scientific research seems eminently reasonable and is politically popular. And I think universities are going to make a huge mistake if they decide to fight this one and demand that taxpayers cough up money with the false threat that they'll stop curing cancer if they don't get more money.
If leading up to this executive order, we were paying 60 cents on the dollar for research grants from the NIH, that seems like a big number. Have we always been paying that number? How did we get to 60%?
So immediately after World War II, when the federal government really became involved in funding research at universities, the overhead rate was 8%. Which means that for every dollar the federal government gave to universities for research, they paid an additional 8 cents for overhead. And this is because the universities didn't really have a large research infrastructure at the time. And this was kind of a new activity. And so the federal government thought, well, they need some overhead to build out research labs, to build new buildings. We were just coming out of a war. And universities needed to start helping us compete with the Soviet Union by having cutting edge research that could not only help cure cancer, but help us beat the Russians. And so it was 8 cents on the dollar. And then that cap went up a little bit to 15 cents. And when I was in grad school, it was in the 30s. But recently it spiked up really high. Actually, it spiked up high one time before. It spiked up high in the 70s, where we started seeing indirect rates up close to 70%. But then there was a scandal at Stanford, where it was discovered that the overhead money was being used to purchase a yacht and to redecorate the office of the president. And this scandal forced the universities to lower their costs. But the scandal went away, and now we're creeping back up to 70 cents on the dollar. Harvard charges 69 cents on the dollar. So we're back up close to the Stanford yacht rates. And we're doing the equivalent of purchasing yachts again. I mean, if you go by a university, you'll see some of the most impressive architecture you've ever seen. That's because you're paying for those buildings, a second and a third time.
Jay Greene, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you to Jay Greene for his contribution to today's episode. You can find more of his work at heritage.org, and you can follow him on X at JPGreene. Thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. As always, you can reach out to us with thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.